from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Westin. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Josh Wingrove from Washington on Democrats moving forward on the NAFTA successor agreement, Anna Edgerton on Speaker Nancy Pelosi moving forward on impeachment, and from London, Therese Raphael on the last days of the British election. So, Josh, let's get started with you. Exactly where are we with USMCA?
Well, the last dominoes look like they're falling, with Nancy Pelosi blessing this deal as well as the AFL-CIO. The three countries themselves are scheduled to sign the changes in about an hour, and this pretty much clears the way for a vote probably next week in Congress. All expectations are that it'll pass there and pass in the Senate afterwards. So we've been, going back and forth for quite some time. Pelosi managed to sort of squeeze some changes out of the Trump administration. Now the administration gets its trade deals. She gets to say that she, made it better, and all sides seem happy with it. So over 2 years after this renegotiation began, it looks like finally this new NAFTA will be on the books.
She did go out of her way, the speaker, to say, look, it's way better than what they sent us from the White House. Do we know in what respects? What are the real differences?
The big one for me is a change on pharmaceutical rules. It's a little bit technical, but the deal would have guaranteed the patent protection for 10 years for biologic drugs. These are very expensive, specialized types of drugs. It really only impacted Canada and Mexico, and it's now out of the deal. That's good news for Canada and Mexico from those governments' perspectives. But the reason she wanted that out of the deal, Pelosi, is that it would free up the U.S. to go under that 10-year number themselves someday. She probably wants to do that. That would be bad news for pharmaceutical companies, but would allow generic drugs to be purchased sooner and therefore drive down costs for consumers or users of those drugs.
Yeah, it always comes back to drug prices. Okay, thanks so much to Josh Wingrove reporting from Washington. And now we go to Bloomberg's Anna Edgerton, because that was not the only thing that happened on Capitol Hill today. We also learned 2 articles of impeachment now will move forward, Anna.
That's right. It was quite the extraordinary morning. Right before that USMCA announcement, we had Pelosi joined by her 6 chairmen that have been investigating the Trump administration, announcing these 2 articles of impeachment. The articles will be abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, and those could come to the floor before next week.
Well, that was what I was going to ask, is what's the timetable? If it comes to the floor by next week, when would there be a vote? When would we expect it? And when would a trial be likely to start over in the Senate?
So the Congress is supposed to be in recess starting December 20th, and they hope to vote in the House before then. At that point, President Trump will be impeached. Now, then the process goes to the Senate, where they will decide whether or not they should actually remove him from office. That trial is expected to start in January and last for 6 to 8 weeks.
We've known the Speaker was reluctant to start this process to begin with. Did she have something of victory in the fact that it really was fairly narrow? As you said, just 2 articles very specifically on abuse of power and obstructing Congress.
I think that was a smart move for Nancy Pelosi, but also one that was kind of calculated looking at her moderate members who are going to be running for re-election in swing districts, because they were worried about this process kind of being drawn out, getting a bit unwieldy by bringing in some of the allegations from Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report, maybe some of the emoluments allegations against the president's businesses, and even some of the tax investigations that the Ways and Means Committee was conducting of President Trump and his businesses. So by the fact that they're focusing these on the Ukraine allegations and obstruction of Congress kind of makes this more bite-sized, not just for House members who will vote on this process, but also for the American people to understand what's at stake and why they're going forward with this process.
Anna, thanks so much for the reporting from Washington. That's Anna Edgerton from our Washington Bureau. And now we go over to London and Therese Raphael, because we are, of course, only a couple of days away from that election now. Give us the latest. Where are the Conservative Party, the Labour Party?
Well, Paul, if this were the U.S., you would almost say that one party would get the presidency and the other the Congress, but it's not. This is a winner-takes-all system. Right now, the Conservatives have held tight to a pretty sizable lead of about 10 points and on average in the polls. But the thing to remember about the UK is it's really a lot of mini elections, and the difference between Boris Johnson majority, even a landslide, and a hung parliament is actually not that great. So I think lots is going to depend on how the Conservatives do in what's being called the Red Wall. Those are the Labour heartlands in the Midlands and the north of the country.
And assuming for the moment that Boris Johnson is elected with the Conservative Party as the Prime Minister, and he does get that Brexit vote, you've written that actually we got to look at what happens after that. It might really hurt the British economy.
Yeah, I mean, the slogan for his campaign is "Get Brexit Done," and it's a bit of a misnomer because actually Brexit won't be immediately done. That's the first thing. He'll get his bill through Parliament for certain, but then there's a whole trade negotiation to be done. But the other thing that voters may not quite realize yet, because there's been so little discussion of it, is that the terms of the deal actually, put some sizable trade friction within the United Kingdom at the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And I think that's the kind of thing that's going to come back and hurt a future Conservative government as that rolls out, as it becomes clear just what that means for businesses trading into Northern Ireland and Northern Irish businesses that are exporting into the rest of the country.
And finally, Therese, talk about the polling, because we've had some problems in British polling, as we have over here in the United States as well. But how reliable do we think the polls are?
Well, I mean, the only thing we can say is that the pollsters have presumably learned from past eras. But that said, it's very hard to poll in this country because of the way the constituencies are almost, self-contained. Tonight, we're expecting an important poll on the methodology called MRP from YouGov. That will be projecting a very large sampling onto the constituencies. That was correct in the 2017 election. It predicted a 58-seat Tory majority the last time they did it, and we'll see if that holds up in a few hours' time. Okay, Therese, thank you so much for reporting this. Therese Raphael from Bloomberg Opinion over in London. And now it's time to get that check on how markets are reacting to today's top stories. Joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. I'm looking at it right now. It looks a little bit mixed.
Yeah, a little meh. Not a lot happening there. So much news, so many headlines, and stocks not moving. And that tells you that they don't think that the UMCA is likely to affect the profit outlook. It tells you that they don't think that the impeachment process right now is likely to affect the profit outlook. What could affect the profit outlook? Trade that we've been talking about so much. We did actually have a headline earlier this morning, China saying that they think that the December 15th tariffs won't happen, but that's not even moving stocks. Investors want something solid. One possibly encouraging sign, the stocks, that chip sector that we've talked about before as a proxy for the trade war, it's actually outperforming. At this point, I think it's up about 0.8%. So that tells you that there's some hope right now around trade, but overall investors want those details. They want something signed.
Okay, so you're talking about trade, you're talking about impeachment, things like that. Today happens to be the day the FOMC is meeting also. We're going to get a decision tomorrow.
Yes.
Normally, we would just be talking about the Fed right now. Right now, we're not.
That's a great point, David, because you're right about that. Typically, that would be all eyes, all ears on the Fed and what will their policy decision be tomorrow. But there's so much other stuff going on at this point. I think the other piece around the Fed, it's pretty much locked in or baked in, the idea that they're not going to really be doing anything. And we were talking about bonds before going on, and down once again today, to your point, over the last 9 days, down 7 of those days. And that tells you that investors aren't overly concerned right now, that the complacency that we're seeing with the VIX relatively suppressed, it doesn't suggest that people are pricing in some kind of big risk-off event. It's going to be interesting to see as we go towards Sunday, December 15th. Yeah. What happens?
It is quite a week, actually, on so many different fronts.
Yes.
With an election in the UK, we've got a deadline on tariffs, we've got possible USMCA. There's a lot going on.
It's a good week for us. Very busy.
Exactly, very busy, exactly. Good to have news. Okay, many thanks to Abigail Doolittle for that check on the markets. And now we turn to Mark Crumpton. He's here with Bloomberg First Word News.
David, as we've been reporting, House Democrats today introduced 2 articles of impeachment against President Trump. He's accused of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress.
The argument, why don't you just wait, amounts to this. Why don't you just let him cheat in one more election? Why not let him cheat just one more time? Why not let him have foreign help just one more time?
And the House Judiciary Committee will vote on the articles of impeachment Thursday. That sets the stage for a vote by the full House next week. House Democrats are planning to vote next week on the revised U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. Speaker Nancy Pelosi says the deal, which will replace NAFTA, was changed to meet her demands.
There is no question, of course, that this trade agreement is much better than NAFTA. But in terms of our work here, it is infinitely better than what was initially proposed by the administration.
The changes that Democrats had demanded included provisions on the environment, pharmaceuticals, labor, and enforcement. In the UK, an embarrassing blow for the Labour Party. A recording of health spokesman John Ashworth has been leaked and published online. On the tape, Ashworth is heard criticizing leader Jeremy Corbyn and saying his party will lose Thursday's general election. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says Brexit won't happen unless his Tories win and that a Corbyn victory would be an economic disaster for Britain. In Lebanon, angry residents attacked city headquarters in Tripoli after a house collapsed overnight, killing 2 people. Protesters smashed windows and set fires. Demonstrations have been taking place nationwide since October as residents protest against what they say is widespread corruption, negligence, and mismanagement. They say authorities had repeatedly ignored calls by the owners to renovate the old house. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, a crowded primary field with an establishment frontrunner. Why Joe Biden's lead in the 2020 primary just might look a lot like Mitt Romney's in 2012. We talk with Kyle Kondik of Sabato's Crystal Ball. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
The House Committee on the Judiciary is introducing 2 articles of impeachment charging the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, with committing high crimes and misdemeanors.
This is a day we've all been working to and working for on the path to yes. There is no question, of course, that this trade agreement is much better than NAFTA.
A remarkable split screen on Capitol Hill today with Speaker Nancy Pelosi coming to proclaim a solemn day as Chairman Nadler announced 2 articles of impeachment against the president. And then, just an hour later, Nancy Pelosi returned to camera, again, this time to announce a day we've all been waiting for, an agreement with President Trump on the new USMCA trade deal. Here to take us through the politics of it all is Kyle Kondik. He is managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia Center for Politics, and he's coming to us from Washington. So welcome, Kyle. So put those 2 things together. What's the strategy on the Democrat side? On the one hand, you're giving President Trump a win on USMCA, I think it's fair to say. On the other hand, you're trying to impeach him.
There is this cliche in politics sometimes that people say that they can walk and chew bubble gum at the same time, and I think that's what the Democrats are trying to show that they're able to do here. On one hand, trying to hold the president accountable for what they see as behavior that is grounds for his impeachment and perhaps advocating for his removal, and on the other side, working with the administration on a trade deal that Democrats and I think the administration seem to like. And I think there's an argument from some that the better course, if you're the opposition party, is just basically to not help the president with anything because you want to make the president look as ineffective as possible. On the other hand, I know there are a lot of Democrats who believe that they want their vulnerable House members to be able to have something to run on that's positive next year. And I think they believe that the USMCA is that. And so that's why you have this, again, it's kind of a strange morning. You have impeachment on one hand, so the ultimate disagreement about the president and between the president and the House. And then on the other hand, you have this big bipartisan deal on trade, which is typically a very divisive issue.
Yeah, as you say, it looked sort of strange on the surface, but I wonder if it makes sense if you look at it through 2 different prisms. One, the election of the House, that's USMCA. We want to make sure we hold on to that if we're a Democrat. The other is who gets to be president. It might be 2 very different answers depending on which question you're asking.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And some of the most vulnerable Democratic House members, the ones that are basically going to were responsible for winning the majority in 2018 and would help the Speaker maintain the majority in 2020. A number of those members, 31 of them actually, are in districts that Donald Trump won for president. Some of those districts are probably going to be pretty competitive for president next year. Some of them will not be. Some of those members are going to have a very difficult vote on impeachment. At the same time, some of those members also want to present something like the USMCA trade deal to their constituents and also rebut Republican attacks that they're just focused on impeachment and that they're just focused on negative things as opposed to a positive governing. And again, I think there are a lot of reasonable disagreements as to which course the Democrats should proceed with here. It seems very clear that the Speaker, though, wants to both do impeachment, or maybe feels obligated to do impeachment, but also wants to give her most vulnerable members something that they could present to voters next year.
We're talking with Kyle Kondik of Sabato's Crystal Ball. And Kyle, let's focus on the presidential election for a moment, because you have former Vice President Joe Biden, who went out well in advance, was up, and then sort of stumbled a bit. Other people gained on him. There were questions about him. He's hanging in, and you have a piece out suggesting that reminds you of somebody who did this before.
Yeah, this race is starting to remind me some of the 2012 Republican race when Mitt Romney ended up leading for most of the time and winning the nomination kind of convincingly. And at various points throughout 2011, you know, it was almost exactly 8 years ago today, Romney looked weak. He was surpassed at various points by candidates like Rick Perry and even Herman Cain and Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum. But ultimately, Romney ended up triumphing because he had the right amount of appeal to the voters in the party who were most important, most notably voters who were not as ideologically extreme, voters who were maybe a little bit more moderate or only identifying as somewhat conservative. And I think there are some parallels with Biden in that Biden, like Romney, is kind of an establishment candidate. He's someone who is pretty well known in the party and pretty well respected. Biden also has the support of a very important and significant moderate voting bloc in the Democratic Party, and that is African-American voters who dominate the voting in many southern states and are an important part of the electorate in many others. And look for all of the predictions that Biden would fade at some point here, that he would fall behind. His national lead is still robust. While he's not doing that great in Iowa and New Hampshire, he is leading polls in Nevada and South Carolina. Those are races that, if he were to be able to win them, could set him up well for Super Tuesday, which follows very closely on the heels of South Carolina. So I don't think there's a really huge favorite in this race right now.
Right.
But I think I'd still probably rather be Biden than anyone else, and I probably would have said the same thing 6 months ago.
Right, final point. What about the money, though? There are reports that Joe Biden may be running somewhat short on cash. Where was Mitt Romney back in 2012? Did he have enough money? Because I don't remember Herman Cain as having a big war chest.
Romney not only was the best fundraiser in that field, although there were other decent fundraisers in that field too, but crucially, Romney also had a very powerful super PAC that ended up playing this kind of game of whack-a-mole against Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum and other candidates in various states. Biden does not have as much money as some of his other competitors, although Biden also has a super PAC that's getting off the ground here. And for as unpopular as the idea of super PACs are amongst Democrats who tend to be more leery of outside money in politics and big money in politics, if Biden's super PAC can raise a fair amount of money, that would be an important weapon for him against other candidates who may be conventionally outraising him.
And Kyle, how much is that tied, the fundraising tied to how he does in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina? At what point do people need to see him really showing up with some numbers in order to contribute to him?
Yeah, that's the challenge here, is that Biden is not as strong with white voters as he is with African-American voters. And, of course, Iowa and New Hampshire are very lily-white states. And so the danger for Biden is not only that he doesn't win Iowa or New Hampshire, but that someone else wins both of them, be it Pete Buttigieg or Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. And then that person maybe establishes themselves as the chief opponent for Biden. And, oh, by the way, to your point, Biden could also look weak to not just the voters, but also to donors. And there's always the potential that money can dry up. You know, money can be a driving factor for a lot of these candidates. And Kamala Harris just got out. Right. I think the fact that her fundraising seemed to be drying up was a big part of that. So that's always the danger. But look, I think that overall, I think Biden is still holding up decently well here despite all of his problems.
Okay, Kyle, always a pleasure to have you on. That's Kyle Kondik of Sabato's Crystal Ball. I want to remind you that Michael Bloomberg is the founder and LP, the parent company of Bloomberg News. Still ahead, shares in the parent company of DSW Shoe Warehouse are plunging today, and tariffs are a key part of the story. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Time now for the stock of the hour. Designer Brands, that's the parent company of DSW, is sinking the most since 2014. The stock is down nearly 15% after the company cut its forecast, in part because of the effect of tariffs. Kaylee Alliance is here to explain what's going on with DSW and Designer Brands.
Yeah, well, it's a really ugly day. One analyst over at CL King said that this report was bordering on disastrous. Not only did the third quarter miss on earnings, but they said the headwinds that they saw in the third quarter are going to persist into year end, and that resulted in a pretty sizable guidance cut. They cut their EPS forecast for the full year by about 22%. They now see it at just $1.55 on the high end. They had previously seen as high as $1.97. Now, in part, they're blaming this on the weather. It's been warmer, that affects seasonality, etc. But then the other part is tariffs. As we know, tariffs on footwear already in place from China. And for the U.S., 70% of footwear imports come from China. So it obviously has a direct effect on DSW. Now, the CEO said that they've had success in mitigating those tariffs, but what they did to mitigate the tariffs weighed heavily on the results.
What did they do to mitigate?
Well, I mean, a lot of what they've done is what a lot of companies do, trying to shift supply out of China, working with vendors to negotiate, et cetera. And they said they've had success at mitigating about 80 to 90% of the tariffs. They will ultimately see about $20 to $30 million in costs remaining. But they took it a step further because they thought that the uncertainty surrounding the trade war potential impact that it could have on economic growth was going to mean that consumers weren't going to spend. So they stopped investing in marketing and pulled back a lot of their inventories. They say in hindsight that was the wrong decision because obviously that consumer pullback didn't materialize. But just to give you a sense, I mean, they doubled down in areas like athletic and kids that do well, but then they cut their inventories in areas like dress shoes by 20%, and that led to a 17% decline in comp sales for that division. So they say they acknowledge that mistake. They said it was the wrong call. We were trying to think if this were to, what would we have done differently if we had a clue of what was going to happen in 2008? They thought a similar kind of scenario was going to play out there, but obviously that's not the case. The consumer is still showing up and spending even aside from tariffs.
You know, it sounds like part of it was operator error, as
right.
you say.
Exactly.
It wasn't just the tariffs. Rather, thank you so much to Kaylee Alliance reporting on DSW. Up next, it looks like the House is finally going to vote on the USMCA agreement. We talk with the co-chairman of the PASS USMCA coalition. He's former 10-term congressman from New York, Joe Crowley. He'll be right here with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, China is expecting the United States to delay a threatened tariff hike set to take effect Sunday. Bloomberg has learned that Beijing sees the option as a chance for both sides to de-escalate tensions and to continue talks. White House Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney spoke at a Wall Street Journal Council CEO event in Washington today.
The trajectory towards a phase one deal is pretty good. So if we can make some progress on phase one here in the next couple of days and weeks, I think that will impact what happens on December 15th.
White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow was also at that event and said he cannot confirm that tariffs will be delayed. He said they are, quote, still on the table. President Trump has some harsh words for FBI Director Christopher Wray. It comes after the release of a federal watchdog report on the origins of a probe into foreign meddling in the 2016 election. Wray says the Inspector General didn't find political bias in the investigation into the Trump campaign. The president said with that kind of attitude, Wray will never be able to fix the FBI. The president called the agency, quote, broken. Elizabeth Warren is rolling out her environmental policy for oceans today. The Democratic presidential candidate says her Blue New Deal will address how climate change is affecting oceans and other waters. Senator Warren says while the oceans are severely threatened, they can also be a major part of the climate solution, from providing new sources of clean energy to supporting a new future of ocean farming. Turkey says it could deploy soldiers in Libya if invited by the internationally backed government there. President Recep Erdogan told Turkish state-run television the deployment would not violate the UN's Libya embargo. Ankara signed a defense agreement last month aimed at strengthening forces controlled by the Libyan government. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts. in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
There is no question, of course, that this trade agreement is much better than NAFTA. But in terms of our work here, it is infinitely better than what was initially proposed by the administration. It's a victory for America's workers. It's one that we take great pride in advancing.
That was Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi earlier today announcing the House Democrats have reached an agreement with the United States White House to move forward with the successor to NAFTA. That's, of course, the USMCA. We welcome now former New York Congressman Joe Crowley. He is now honorary co-chairman of the past USMCA coalition. So welcome. Great to have you with us, Joe. Are you out of a job?
Oh, no, certainly not. There's many more coalitions to come, I think, in the future, especially as it pertains to trade and looking forward. But I do think, it's important to know what is exactly in this bill. As the Speaker indicated, has said that this is a different bill than was proposed initially. So I think the details are important, certainly as it pertains to the environment, an entire chapter. I'm sure that the labor changes are also some things I think you can see in a template moving forward. But I think on the issue of IP, intellectual property, and particularly on biopharma, having that, as I'm led to believe, although I don't know the details yet, that may be extracted from the agreement, that, extracting a $500 billion plus industry from future agreements certainly is not a template moving forward.
So let's talk specifically about, I think they're called biologics, where, as I understand it, there's a different length of protection. The United States has 10 years. We have Canada, I think, has 8. Mexico has 6. And there was an initial proposal that it all be made at 10. That is no longer the case. What does that do to, effectively, the price of drugs potentially down the road?
Really nothing at this point. In fact, the U.S. has a 12-year exclusivity period, and really, these are the frontier of drug exploration in terms of biopharma. And it's an enormous industry here in the United States. Many jobs are linked to the industry as well. It's where we really lead the world in terms of pharma development and these biologics. And so it is a critical industry for the United States. It will be, especially in terms of negotiating future trade agreements, not so much with this agreement, but future trade agreements with, for instance, Japan, the UK, or the EU, quite frankly.
And, Joe, we know that labor was very important in this negotiation. We had the AFL-CIO, Mr. Trumka, really playing a substantial role. Is this, I understand it, one of the main enforcement provisions, which there'll be a provision where they actually can take it to arbitration if there's a contention about the labor provisions?
Again, having not actually seen the final product, again, only going from conjecture, which I'm assuming you're reading from as well, I do think that that's a substantial change here in terms of not only this agreement, but future negotiations as well. As I said earlier, I think when it comes to the issue of the environment, as well as labor and enforcement provisions, this is a very strong agreement, I believe, has been worked out. But again, where I have a real concern is the lack of protection for intellectual property and for U.S. companies here in competition with companies abroad. That's a very important aspect of our economy and needs to be protected in future agreements.
Joe, talk us about the politics of this. You were a Democrat representing a district here in New York for 10 terms, as I say. Yes. Is this a good thing for Democrats? Because it had been thought maybe that's a victory for the president, which might not be good for Democrats.
Well, I think that certainly, given the remarks that I've seen by Speaker Pelosi and Chairman Neal and others, that this certainly has a Democratic imprimatur on it. Keep in mind, David, that when this agreement was entered into by the Trump administration, Democrats were not in control of the House of Representatives. And so there was a nuance here that was not in play prior to this year. And I think that this agreement, by all indications, is going to have a very strong Democratic imprimatur, especially, as I said, as it comes to the issues of the environment, labor, and more importantly, the enforcement of those provisions.
And finally, Congressman, is this a done deal? Because as I understand it, we have representatives now down in Mexico City negotiating with the Mexicans. I think they may have to agree to something. Do you think that that's just a formality, or might there be a problem?
Well, nothing's ever done until it's done, as something we've all learned. But I think all indications are that it's moving forward. This is, when it comes to the agricultural sector, there's no question this is a good deal. I think when it comes to auto and manufacturing and for auto workers, this is a good deal. I think the involvement of labor in this agreement is very critical. But as I said, again, only knowing what I'm being reported, again, I have those concerns about intellectual property, especially as it pertains to the biopharma industry, and that this I don't think should be interpreted as a template for moving forward in future trade agreements.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us today. That's former Democratic Congressman from New York, Joe Crowley. Coming up, President Trump has been outspoken in his criticism of the World Trade Organization, refusing to approve new members to its appellate panel. We talk with WTO Director-General, he's Roberto Azevedo, about what this means for the decision-making at the body. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. President Trump has blocked new appointments to the WTO appellate panel, which means that as of midnight tonight, the body will no longer have the required quorum to issue rulings. To discuss what comes next, welcome now Roberto Azevedo. He is Director General of the WTO, and he's coming to us today from Geneva. Welcome, Mr. Director General. Great to have you with us. So give us a sense of how big a threat this is to the ongoing functioning of the WTO. Can it keep going without that appellate panel?
Well, what it does mean is that members now cannot follow the normal way of conducting their disputes. So normally you would have the panel. After the panel, you could resort to the appellate body, and then you would have the appeal itself. Now, that appeal is not going to happen any longer. So there are two types of conversations happening in Geneva. So I'm intensifying consultations to see whether we can fix that so that this regular channel continues to operate in a modified form, maybe. And the other type of conversation that is happening here is, while we don't find a solution for that, are there alternative mechanisms, other type of, stopgap mechanisms that we can set up for the countries who want to continue to have that two-step approach. And those two conversations are going to happen simultaneously. It will take a little bit of time, but we are instilling the sense of urgency that is needed now.
So when you talk about the alternative mechanism, I've read about some European countries proposing sort of an alternative sort of arbitration process that perhaps China has indicated they'd be interested in going along with. If it goes that direction, will that take care of the problem without the United States? That is to say, the United States, I presumably, would be excluded from that process.
Well, it doesn't fully take care of the problem because, of course, the United States is not likely to be in, and that's the largest economy in the world. So it is, like I said, an interim solution, a stopgap measure, something like that. The EU has been talking about this. China has been talking about this. Other important and big WTO members are also talking about that. They are discussing amongst themselves. I'm hopeful that some kind of outcome is going to come from that conversation, but I'm not sure that they already agree on what exactly they want from these conversations. So we need to figure that out, too.
We are talking with Roberto Azevedo. He is Director General of the WTO. Are there discussions going with the United States? Is there any possibility with Mr. Lighthizer, for example, to actually reconcile the problem so that the United States will go back in and start approving some members to this panel?
I think we could. I think we could. But the reality is that the grievances that they have expressed, the U.S. administration, concerning the appellate body function, they're pretty significant. So we're not talking about a mere adjustment here or there. I think the kind of things that they have been talking about would require pretty significant changes in the way that the appeals would be conducted. And what we need at this point in time is understand a little bit better what would take care of those concerns that the Americans have been expressing, and also whether the type of things that are needed would be acceptable to everybody else. I think there is open-mindedness in Geneva. People are willing to explore new ideas, new solutions. People are open-minded. But we have to test. We have to see what exactly we would be talking about in terms of bridging that gap.
Director-General Azevedo, is the United States open-minded in your dealings with them? Because it's not just, as I understand it, appellate panel members. There's also a budget issue that's looming where the United States has been holding back on that as well. Do you believe that the U.S. administration at this point generally wants reform of the WTO, or does it really want to do away with it?
My feeling is that if the United States really wanted to do away with the organization, they would have done already. I really don't believe that that is the case. In fact, the WTO budget has been approved today. So just a few hours ago, we had the approval of the budget, so we will continue. And the budget, in its essence, the bulk of the budget had no changes whatsoever, no amendments. So we will continue to provide the services we were providing before as efficiently as before. There were no cuts or anything of the kind. But there were limitations in terms of use of resources to fund the appellate body, which is expected, as you can imagine, under the circumstances. So I think the U.S. Is willing to explore, but it will require, I think it would only settle for some significant changes. I don't think that adjusting things at the margins is going to be enough.
Director General Azevedo, this is not the only trade dispute going on in the world right now. As we know, we've got U.S.-China situations, we've got Brexit situations. We have a lot of pressure on U.S. trade, on global trade, downward pressure. Have we seen the high water mark for globalization, in your opinion?
I think the case for trade liberalization is tougher today than it was before. A lot of the circumstances and the reasons that we see out there, they are structural in nature. The world is changing significantly. The way the economy operates has significantly changed. Automation is taking away 8 out of 10 jobs that are lost today in the market. You know, that's the ballpark anyway. Which means that we're not going to go back to where we were before, simply because the economy is growing. The types of jobs are going to be different. The types of opportunities are going to be different. We need to be responsive to all that. And I don't think that until we begin to adjust to this new 21st digital economy, I don't think that we're going to find an end to these attritions, to these difficulties. I think this is turbulence that we're going to be facing for the near future.
Okay, Mr. Azevedo, really appreciate you joining us. That's WTO Director-General Roberto Azevedo coming to us from Geneva. Coming up here, France is moving into a second week of protests over pension reform, and Britain is moving toward an election just 2 days from right now. We talk with Nicholas Dungan of the Atlantic Council. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. French President Macron is facing the biggest opposition to his policies yet, with hundreds of thousands taking to the streets over possible pension reforms. Welcome now, Nicholas Dungan. He is Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, coming to us today from Paris. So welcome, Nicholas. It's really good to have you with us. We watch these demonstrations in the streets. We hear about the transportation getting shut down. We hear about the schools getting shut down. Why? To an American, what's going on?
It's not just to an American. The French are asking themselves the same question. This is a political failure by Emmanuel Macron and by the French government. There are 42 different state pension plans, many of them giving special privileges, and there are no private pension systems in France, which may be very surprising to anybody familiar with the US, the UK, or the Netherlands. But this reforming needs to be done at some point. It's exactly the kind of thing you would do, push through in the first 100 days of a second term. There was no reason to do it now, and it's been a series of miscommunications, miscalculations by the government, and people are as angry at the government as they are really in favor of the pension reform.
So, Nicholas, explain one thing to me, if you could. In the first 100 days, I think it was, of his first term, Mr. Macron really had labor reform on the agenda. And as I recall, he put that through, and a lot of people thought there would be demonstrations. Not so much. Why is this so different? I would have thought, actually, there would have been more objections to actual labor law reform than to pensions.
No, because, first of all, the French don't like change because they think you're going to take something away from them. And that's what they're convinced of here. basically, to solve the pension problem, people either have to take a lower pension or work longer. And there are lots of special privileges for railway workers, for metro workers, and for different categories. That's why there are 42 different pension plans. Even lawyers have their own special states pension plan. So the problem here is you're taking away privileges that they feel they've earned, and that basically everybody feels they will either get less money or have to work longer or both. So it's more about a sense of injustice. There are 68% of the French people who actually approve of the strikes. And 68% of the French people are not against the pension reform. So this is really also about the unpopularity of Emmanuel Macron, who, I have to say, I don't think it's looking as good as it was for his re-election in 2022.
Can he back down?
He's going to have to back down to some extent. And he's trying to put the onus on the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, just as Jacques Chirac did back in the 90s when, Alain Juppé had to back down. But the problem is now that with a 5-year presidential term and a 5-year legislative term, and especially as much of a micromanager as Macron is, and somebody who basically thinks of himself as the smartest guy in the room, much like Obama did, essentially the perception is that it is Macron who's taking all the decisions. And he's given out some very mixed messages, both for in terms of what his prime minister is saying and in terms of the specialists that he has appointed to take care of this. And then he jumps in with something that doesn't make sense with what's being proposed. So the government is supposed to make its proposals tomorrow, and the strikes are already happening now. What's wrong with this picture? It's total disorganization.
Okay, well, let's go across the channel and see if there's disorganization over in Britain now. There's a little election coming up on Thursday.
Talk about something easy.
Yeah, exactly. What do you expect to come out of Thursday? What comes next?
Okay, I think so. We go from one easy subject to the next, right? Thanks for that. Essentially, there are two options. Either the Tories come out, the Conservative Party gets a majority, in which case Boris Johnson will, quote, deliver Brexit by January 31st. The withdrawal agreement bill, which we've talked about before, will be passed. And then he said he won't request an extension for the new trade agreement and the many other agreements that need to be made by the end of 2020. We'll see about that. He's gone back on a lot of stuff. On the other hand, if there's tactical voting, for example, for the Liberal Democrats, then what can happen is you will have a hung parliament. And if you have a hung parliament, you will almost certainly have to have a second referendum. And if you have a second referendum, then it could be reversing the Brexit decision, and there'll be a lot of confusion for some time to come. The polls showed Boris Johnson ahead, but they also showed Theresa May ahead last time 2 years ago, and she ended up with no majority and had to form a small coalition with the Northern Ireland DUP party. So it's going to go on, and even though Johnson is saying, let's get Brexit done, whatever happens, Brexit won't be done for a very, very long time.
And that's the point I wanted to get to, was even if they get Brexit done in the sense of the separation, that doesn't say what comes next. They still have another negotiation to go, right, to determine the relationship going forward.
It's a whole series of negotiations, because what the Brits don't seem to have taken on board is that the European Union is not just a trading bloc. There are health standards, there are food standards, there are security issues, there are border issues, and all of even though the UK is outside the Schengen area, all of these things will need to be negotiated. So my prediction would be that in order to get this thing over the line by the end of 2020, if Boris Johnson gets a majority, if the withdrawal agreement bill is passed, he will actually align completely with Europe, which will mean that basically the UK will be like Norway, paying money and not part of the decision-making process.
Wouldn't that be ironic? Not exactly what the people were sold on with Brexit. Okay, thank you so much to Nicholas Dungan of the Atlantic Council over in Paris. Thanks for being with us, Nicholas. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll talk to Harvard law professor and Bloomberg opinion columnist Noah Feldman on the legal case for impeachment. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.